Chapter 1. The Unexpected Arrival. It had been a quiet night on the small outpost of Verita, nestled on the rugged, barren moon that circled the desolate planet of Arion. The stars were particularly brilliant that evening, their lights slicing through the endless blackness like cold, sharp needles. The wind howled, sending dust and sand spiraling through the narrow streets of the outpost, the familiar gusts scraping against the walls of the old, dilapidated structures. As always, there was a faint smell of metal and oil that filled the air, a reminder of the machines that never quite stopped running, even in the harshest environments. And among the flickering lights and rumbling engines of the outpost, there was him, John, an ex-soldier turned mechanic, trying to make a life out of whatever scraps he could find. He'd never asked for any of this, never asked for the loneliness, the pain, or the sense of alienation that gnawed at him every day. All he had now was the old station, his tools, and the endless empty space surrounding him. And then, everything changed. It wasn't supposed to happen. Not here, not on this forsaken rock in the middle of nowhere. The last thing he expected on this godforsaken outpost was to be faced with an unexpected responsibility, an unrelenting challenge that would push him far beyond what he thought his life could ever be. But, as with all things in the universe, the unexpected found him one night. A flashing light, an urgent transmission, the cry of an unknown child, a cry that would echo through the corridors of his life forever. John had been repairing the engines of a nearby freighter when the transmission first came through. His fingers, smeared with grease and oil, fumbled with the buttons on the console as the message appeared on his screen. The words weren't what he expected: no friendly greeting, no trade offers, no communication from the usual passersby. No, it was a message in a language he didn't recognize, a transmission from somewhere deep within the galaxy. It had a strange, melodic quality to it, one that resonated in his very bones as though it was meant for him alone. And then, just as he was about to dismiss it, a new image appeared on the screen. The image was blurry at first, then slowly came into focus. It was a woman, her face partially obscured by shadows, but there was no mistaking the urgency in her eyes. She looked desperate, wild even, as if she had been running from something, and in her arms, she held a small bundle. At first, John thought it was a piece of equipment, perhaps a stray cargo, or a malfunctioning sensor, but as the woman's face came into sharper view, so did the tiny hands and the small, delicate face of a child. It was then that the message was delivered. Help us. She will be the end of us, but you have to raise her. No one else can. She's the last of us. Please take her and protect her. She's your responsibility now. Please. The transmission ended abruptly. The screen went black, and John was left staring at the empty console, his heart pounding in his chest as the weight of the words hit him. He had no idea what was happening, no idea who this woman was, or why she was asking him to raise a child. And yet, there was something in her voice, a desperate, pleading tone that stuck with him, that made him question everything he had known about the galaxy, about his place in it, and about the future. It was a moment he would never be able to forget. As if guided by some invisible force, John found himself walking through the winding corridors of the station, his mind racing, his thoughts in disarray. It wasn't long before he reached the docking bay, where a small, beat-up shuttle was waiting, its hull covered in dust and grime. The hatch was open, and inside, there was a sense of quiet chaos. The room was littered with scattered papers, bits of broken machinery, and the remnants of whatever had been left behind. John stepped inside, his boots clicking against the metal floor, and as he did, he noticed her. The woman. She lay there on the floor of the shuttle, her body battered and bruised, as if she had been through hell and back. She was breathing softly, but there was no doubt in his mind that she was dying. And cradled in her arms was the child, a little girl, no older than a few months, her tiny form wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide and filled with innocence. It was then that the full weight of what had been asked of him hit him like a freight train. This was no ordinary child. She was no ordinary being. There was something about her, something strange, something otherworldly that set her apart from any human he had ever known. It was as if the child wasn't meant to exist in this world, as if she had been born of the stars themselves. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were not like the eyes of a human child. They were large, glowing, almost luminous, with an eerie shade of violet that seemed to shift with the light. And yet, despite everything the woman's desperate plea, the child's strange, alien beauty, John couldn't help but feel a surge of protectiveness rise in his chest. This was his responsibility now. The child, this innocent being, was his to raise. No one else would do it. And though the galaxy was vast, filled with unknown dangers, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wouldn't let anyone take her from him. The woman's last breath came shortly after he had secured the child in his arms. He watched as her body went limp, her features softening into a peaceful expression. The only thing left in the shuttle was silent except for the faint hum of the station's systems and the soft coo of the baby in his arms. For the first time in a long while, John felt a sense of purpose settle over him. It was strange, overwhelming, but it was there, undeniable. This was his new life now. He was no longer just a mechanic, no longer just a man wandering through the vast emptiness of space, avoiding connection, avoiding anything that might tether him to the world. He was a father now, and in the cold, desolate darkness of the outpost, he would raise this child. John didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how he would manage. But he knew one thing. He would protect her. He would give her the love and care she needed, and in return, she would become his reason to fight, his reason to live. The child was his now, and whatever came next, they would face it together. John sat in the dimly lit room of his outpost, cradling the tiny child in his arms. She was barely a year old, her tiny fingers gripping his shirt as though she instinctively sought the warmth of his embrace. Her alien eyes, glowing with an eerie violet hue, studied him intently. There was something deeply unsettling about her gaze, as though she could see right through him, past all the layers of his defenses. The sensation made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, but he pushed it aside. She was just a child no matter how alien she might appear. The woman's last words echoed in his mind. She's the last of us. Please, raise her, protect her. John had never been a man of many words. He had learned long ago to keep his thoughts to himself, bury them beneath the mechanical hum of his work. But now, those words kept replaying in his head like a haunting melody. He had no idea what they meant, or why this child, this half-alien girl, was so important. But one thing was clear. He was her only hope. There was no one else to turn to. He looked at her again. Her features were delicate, almost ethereal, with high cheekbones and a small, slightly pointed chin. Her skin, a pale shade of blue, shimmered faintly under the weak light of the station. Her hair, silvery and almost translucent, floated around her head like a halo, a subtle glow emanating from each strand. She was unlike any child he had ever seen. There was no denying it, she wasn't human, not in the traditional sense. But despite everything, she was still a child, and that was enough for him to know what his duty was. The station was quiet, save for the distant hum of machinery. A mechanical whir from one of the old engines brought him back to reality. He could hear the cries of his own thoughts, screaming at him to figure things out. How was he supposed to raise this child? What kind of life could he offer her? The thought that ran through his mind, what if I fail her, made his chest tighten. But deep down, there was no question. He had already made his decision, even if he wasn't fully prepared for it. There were no answers for him in the manual, no instructions on how to raise a child who was more than just human. There were no comforting words or family to lean on. This was a new chapter, a strange, daunting adventure that no one could have predicted. Yet, as he looked down at the child in his arms, her violet eyes locking onto his, he understood one undeniable truth. She needed him, and he couldn't let her down. John gently rocked her, hoping to soothe the restless tension in both their bodies. The child let out a soft, plaintive cry, but it wasn't one of distress, it was a sound that seemed to speak of confusion, of displacement. She didn't understand why she was here, why she was now in the care of a human, far from the world she had come from. He whispered, more to himself than to her, "It's okay. I'll figure this out. We'll figure this out together." As the hours passed, John carefully cleaned and prepared a small bed for the child in one of the corners of the station. His hands, usually steady and confident when working with machinery, trembled as he laid her down. He couldn't help it, he was terrified, unprepared for the weight of the responsibility he had just taken on. The child was his now, and there was no turning back. As she settled into the makeshift bed, Her soft breathing was the only sound that filled the room. John sat nearby, keeping watch over her, his mind racing through 1,000 questions, none of which had clear answers. The night stretched on, the stars outside the station's windows twinkling coldly. Yet, in the small room, surrounded by the hum of ancient engines and the quiet breaths of a child who wasn't his, John felt the first flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Chapter 2. A New World. The next few weeks passed in a blur of confusion and adaptation. John, with no prior experience in child rearing, found himself fumbling through every task. He wasn't entirely sure how to feed her, what to call her, or how to comfort her when she cried. But as the days wore on, he began to notice the little things, the way her eyes would glow brighter when he spoke to her, how she would reach out with her tiny, delicate fingers whenever he got too far away. It was a form of communication, silent yet profound, and it seemed as though she was learning just as much about him as he was about her. He had never been good at opening up, never learned how to talk about his emotions. He had spent years burying his feelings beneath the weight of his work, his isolation, and the scars of past battles. But now, with the child in his care, something inside him began to shift. The loneliness that had once defined his existence started to fade as he took on this new role. His heart, once a locked fortress, had begun to crack open, and in the process, it had created a bond with a child he barely knew, but one he was growing to love. The child who he had taken to calling Lyra, after the constellation that had been visible the night she arrived, was a mystery. He knew little about her species, save for the cryptic message the woman had left behind. She was different, yes, but John had quickly come to realize that there was more to her than just her strange appearance. As the days passed, Lyra began to show signs of intelligence and growth that went far beyond that of a normal child. At times, when John spoke to her, he could swear she understood more than she let on. There were moments when she would mimic his movements, her tiny hands reaching for the tools on the workbench as if she was learning by observation. She watched him as he repaired the broken parts of the station, her eyes following every movement with a keen intensity that made him wonder if she had some kind of extraordinary potential, if, perhaps, she wasn't just a child, but a being with a future greater than anything he could ever imagine. One evening, while John was fixing a damaged communications array, Lyra crawled over to him, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached up and tugged on his sleeve, a soft cry escaping her lips. He looked down at her, startled. She was staring at him with those violet eyes, her gaze unwavering, as though she was asking him something he couldn't yet understand. "Lyra," he said softly, his voice a mixture of awe and concern. "What is it? What do you need?" To his surprise, she held out her small hand, her fingers trembling as she pointed toward the door, her eyes wide with curiosity. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition. John stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his coveralls. He wasn't sure what she was asking for, but he followed her lead. She had already proven to him that she was no ordinary child. Perhaps, just perhaps, she was trying to tell him something important. With Lyra by his side, John stepped out into the cold, silent night, the stars overhead like distant witnesses to the unfolding story of his life. There was no telling what tomorrow would bring, no telling what dangers lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, John felt ready. He wasn't alone anymore, and neither was she. The night air outside the station was sharp and biting. It had always been cold on Verita, the kind of cold that cuts through clothing and settles deep into your bones, making you keenly aware of the vast emptiness surrounding the moon. The winds had picked up, sending sand and dust swirling into the air, but John barely noticed. His attention was consumed by the little girl beside him, her small hand clutching the edge of his sleeve as she gazed out into the void. Her violet eyes reflected the light from the distant stars, and for a moment, John felt an odd sense of connection to the vast expanse stretching before him, both lost and searching for something, uncertain but unwilling to stop moving. Lyra had led him outside, as though drawn to something, but what? The silence between them was thick, but John didn't mind it. The days had passed so quickly, each one blending into the next. His life, once consumed by routine and machinery, now revolved around her, around the mystery that she was, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was more than just a child. She wasn't the helpless infant he had thought her to be when she first arrived. No, she was far more than that. He glanced down at her, and as he did, he saw her standing still, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the distant stars. She was staring at something in the distance, her head slightly tilted, her body rigid as though she could sense something he couldn't. Her little fingers twitched, and she began to move again, pulling him along toward the edge of the station's landing platform, where the wind was howling the loudest. The place was a narrow precipice, overlooking the barren land below, the rocky surface of the moon stretching out into an infinite desert of nothingness. "Lyra," John called softly, his voice carried away by the wind. "What are you trying to show me?" She didn't answer. She never did. Instead, she stopped suddenly, her eyes focused on a distant shadow, something that John could barely make out through the storm of dust and debris. He squinted against the wind, trying to catch a glimpse of what had caught her attention. At first, he thought it was just the shape of a rock or a trick of the light, but as the storm cleared for a brief second, he saw it. A figure standing on the edge of the distant horizon. It wasn't human. John's heart skipped a beat as he realized the figure wasn't alone. More shapes appeared from behind the rock's large, hulking creatures, their forms obscured by the swirling dust. They were moving toward him, but what were they? There was something familiar about their shapes, but he couldn't quite place it. Panic began to build in his chest. His first instinct was to retreat, to run back into the safety of the station, but Lyra didn't move. She stood there, her tiny feet planted firmly in the sand, her eyes fixed on the approaching figures. John reached down, instinctively pulling her closer to him. "Come on, we need to get inside." But to his surprise, Lyra tugged away from his grasp, moving toward the edge of the platform. She was unafraid, her small steps confident, as though she knew exactly what was happening. It was as if she understood the situation better than he did. The wind was howling louder now, but in the midst of the noise, John heard it a soft, almost melodic hum, coming from the direction of the figures. His pulse quickened, a cold chill creeping down his spine. He didn't know who or what they were, but something told him this was far from ordinary. Lyra, still holding his hand, had a strange calmness in her demeanor, her body relaxed but her eyes now glowing brighter than ever. The violet hue seemed to pulse with each beat of her heart, as though connected to whatever was out there. And then, in the silence that followed, the first figure stepped forward. It was humanoid, but there was something unmistakably alien about it, the sharp angles of its limbs, the elongated form that seemed to stretch too tall for any human. Its skin shimmered, a reflective silver that caught the faint light of the stars, and its eyes, much like Lyra's, glowed with an eerie light. John's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to run. He should run. But then the figure spoke, its voice a strange, musical tone that was both otherworldly and strangely familiar. "You have the child. You are the one she chose." John froze, his mind racing. "What? Who are you?" he managed to stammer, his voice thick with confusion and fear. The figure tilted its head, and its glowing eyes flickered in a way that almost seemed to be amused. "We are the Watchers. We have been waiting for her return. And you, human, are now bound to her fate." John felt a weight in the pit of his stomach. Bound to her fate? What the hell was that supposed to mean? Before he could ask more questions, another figure, this one taller, more imposing, stepped forward. Its voice was deep, resonant. "The child will not grow up alone. She will be trained, protected. Her destiny is intertwined with the stars, and yours is now with hers." John stepped back, his mind scrambling to make sense of what he was hearing. This was no random encounter. They knew about Lyra, knew things he couldn't even begin to understand. "We need to go," he said, voice shaking. "This is too much." But Lyra, her violet eyes never leaving the Watchers, only took a single step forward. She was fearless, and for the first time, John realized that maybe she wasn't the helpless child he had thought she was. She knew something he didn't. As the figures approached, their forms becoming more solid in the moonlight, John felt the immense weight of his new reality crash down on him. He wasn't just raising an alien child. He was now a part of something far greater, something that spanned the very fabric of the galaxy itself. And that, he realized, was only the beginning. Chapter 3, The Path of the Watchers. John couldn't quite shake the unease that clung to him as the Watchers continued to approach. The alien beings moved with such precision, their tall forms casting elongated shadows against the barren moon. He glanced at Lyra, who was standing still, her gaze locked onto the Watchers as though she were communing with them. The way they spoke about her like she was the center of their universe, the fulfillment of some ancient prophecy, left John feeling like an outsider, an unwilling participant in a game he didn't understand. He wanted to ask them what they meant by bound to her fate, but he felt a strange pressure in his chest, as if their very presence was suffocating him, stifling his words before they could escape. It was a subtle force, but powerful enough that it made him hesitate. Something was happening, something far bigger than he could grasp, and he was caught right in the middle of it. The Watchers stopped a few feet away from him, their strange, glowing eyes never wavering from Lyra. John could feel the weight of their attention on him now, their silent judgment, and though they hadn't done anything overtly threatening, he felt like he was standing on the edge of something enormous, something dangerous. "You have kept her safe so far," one of the Watchers said, its voice soft but powerful. "But the time has come for her to fulfill her purpose. She has a path to walk, one that no human can walk with her." John didn't know what to say to that. He wanted to argue, to claim his right to protect Lyra as he saw fit, but the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to hand her over to whatever fate they had in mind for her. Lyra, however, seemed unbothered. She stepped forward, her tiny, glowing hand reaching out toward the Watcher, who knelt down to her level. The interaction was peaceful, almost serene, as if there was a deep understanding between the two. John's heart thudded in his chest, his protective instincts kicking in, but he couldn't stop her. There was something about the way Lyra moved, the way she carried herself with such confidence, that made him feel like she wasn't his to protect anymore. She had a destiny, a purpose that was far beyond him. "What happens now?" John finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The Watcher looked at him, its glowing eyes narrowing slightly. "Now, you learn what it means to be her protector. You will guide her through the path that has been set before her." John felt a deep pang of uncertainty, but he nodded. He had no other choice. He had come to care for this child, despite the overwhelming uncertainty of her origins, her purpose. And if this was the path they were meant to walk, then he would walk it with her. He had to. The Watchers seemed satisfied with his response, their silent approval hanging in the air. And in that moment, John realized that his life would never be the same. The air grew thicker, almost suffocating with the tension that hung between them. John stood motionless, unable to look away as Lyra, still bathed in the soft glow of the Watcher's gaze, reached her tiny hand toward the nearest one. There was a strange, calming energy emanating from her, as if the child herself was already attuned to the cosmic forces at play, forces that John couldn't hope to understand. The Watcher, whose glowing eyes were now dimmed to a more tranquil hue, slowly lowered its hand in return, almost as if it were acknowledging an unspoken agreement. Lyra's eyes shone bright, her violet irises flashing with an intelligence far beyond her age, as though she was carrying the weight of ages in her tiny form. John felt a deep ache in his chest. He had thought himself prepared for this moment, but it was clear now that he wasn't. The child he had cradled, the child he had sworn to protect, was destined for something far greater than a simple life on a barren moon. He was just a guardian, a fleeting presence in her long, uncharted path. And that realization was more painful than he could have ever expected. As the Watchers observed this interaction, one of them, the one that had first spoken to John, turned its attention back to him, its voice once again low and melodic. "The child will leave you soon. Her destiny is not meant to be bound to the small world you call home. She has seen the stars. She will return to them." John's heart sank. "No, she's only a child. I'm her father, her protector. I can't let her go." His voice trembled with an intensity he hadn't known he was capable of. The words poured from him without thought, driven by a force of love and fear that he couldn't suppress. He had come to care for her, to see her as his own. The Watcher's expression remained unreadable, its alien features unreadable as ever. "You will always be her protector, but the stars call to her. She will not stay long. She will return to where she belongs." John took a step forward, feeling the cold wind whip through his clothes, his heart thundering in his chest. And what happens to her? What happens to me? She will learn, came the response. She will remember her place in the universe. And when she is ready, she will choose her path. As for you, your task is to guide her through the remaining years of her childhood. She must experience her growth here, under the warmth of the stars, not in the cold isolation you call home. You will help her understand her true power. The rest will unfold as it must. John's pulse quickened, and he could feel his hands trembling. His mind raced with questions that had no answers. The weight of responsibility, of all that had been thrust upon him, was overwhelming. He was no hero, just a mechanic, a solitary man who had stumbled upon a child who wasn't his to keep. Lyra turned to him then, her tiny fingers reaching for his hand, pulling him out of his frantic thoughts. Her gaze, soft and yet fierce, met his, and in that moment, he saw something that terrified him, a reflection of the infinite universe within her eyes, the weight of her destiny, and the promise of something far beyond his understanding. Despite her small form, she was already so much more than he was. He was just her protector, but she was the key to something far greater. John knelt down, his hands trembling as he touched her glowing face. He didn't know if he could do this. He didn't know if he could let her go, if he could truly raise her to the fullness of her potential. But he had to try. "I'll do whatever it takes," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone around him. "I'll protect you, Lyra, until the very end." The watchers, observing this quiet pledge, seemed satisfied. The wind died down, and the stars above shone a little brighter, as if acknowledging the moment. The figures turned as one and began to retreat, their forms blending into the desert, leaving only their words lingering in the air. "She will return to us when she is ready, and you will know when it is time. Be patient, and the path will reveal itself." And with that, they vanished, disappearing into the darkness from whence they came. John stood, his heart heavy, his mind racing. The child, his Lyra, was already moving towards something else, something beyond his reach. But he would remain, rooted here, as the anchor that kept her grounded. He would be the one to help her understand who she was, who she could become. Lyra looked up at him once more, her eyes filled with something unspoken, something ancient. In that fleeting glance, he understood that their bond wasn't one of ownership, but one of shared purpose, of mutual destiny. She would leave him one day. She would return to the stars, to her true people. But not yet. She needed him, and he would be there for her, through it all. Chapter 4, The Final Departure. Years passed, each day blending into the next. Verita had become home, not just for John, but for Lyra as well. The small outpost, with its windswept deserts and cold nights, had transformed into a place of strange beauty. The child had grown, and so had John. He had become the father she needed, though every day felt like walking a tightrope between the past he had known and the future that loomed ahead. Lyra was no longer the small, innocent child he had first cradled in his arms. She had blossomed into something extraordinary. Her violet eyes, once innocent and full of wonder, now held a quiet wisdom, a depth that no child her age should possess. Her movements were graceful and fluid, almost otherworldly, and her intelligence seemed boundless. It was clear that her destiny was not that of a human, not that of any being of this world. Yet, despite her power, she remained grounded in the love John had shown her, in the world he had created for her, even though she wasn't meant to stay in it forever. One evening, as they stood on the edge of the station, watching the stars above, Lyra turned to him. The wind swept through her silvery hair, and her eyes glowed softly in the dim light of the setting sun. "It's time," she said softly, her voice as melodic as ever, carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. John's heart skipped a beat. "Time for what?" "To leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "To fulfill my destiny. The stars have called me, just as they called my people before me." He looked at her, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had known this day would come, but that didn't make it any easier. I thought I would have more time," he murmured, the words catching in his chest. "You gave me the time I needed," Lyra said, her hand gently touching his. "You gave me a life, and for that, I will always be grateful." John felt a tear slip down his cheek, though he didn't know why. Was it sadness? Relief? Regret? Or simply the realization that his purpose, his connection to her, had always been to guide her to this point? It had never been about keeping her for himself. Lyra stepped back, and John knew that their time together was drawing to a close. The stars above seemed to brighten, as if to mark the moment, and in the distance, a soft hum began to grow louder. It was a sound he recognized, the sound of the Watchers, of the ancient beings who had once warned him of this moment. Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "I will never forget you, Father," she said, her voice filled with a sense of finality, yet with love. "I will carry you with me, always." With that, she turned toward the horizon, where a beam of light now shot down from the heavens, illuminating the path she was meant to follow. She stepped forward, disappearing into the light. John stood there, his heart heavy but full. He had given her what she needed: the time, the love, the protection. Now, it was time for her to fulfill her destiny. As the light enveloped her, he whispered, "Goodbye, Lyra. Be the light you were always meant to be." And with that, she was gone, leaving him alone under the stars that had once been so distant. But now, they seemed just a little closer, as though he had always been part of them, and they a part of him.